I want to welcome you all to the 15th Robert J. Lampman Memorial Lecture. This is the sixth one I've organized, and I'm very pleased to have Larry Katz here to present on a topic that is very interesting to us all. And I'm going to introduce Larry in a minute, but first of all, per usual, I have to say a few things about Bob Lampman. Some of the ones I said last year that many of you weren't here to listen to, I'll repeat, but there's some new ones. So this is Bob. This is a favorite picture of his son, John, and this is how he looked in 1971 when I walked in here to graduate school and when Sheldon Danziger showed up here and various other people after. Bob, was a great teacher. His way of teaching a class was to ask a question. What do you think about this inequality thing? Or what do you think about these in-kind benefits? And he'd say, well, I don't know. Well, are they really transfers? What's the incidence of transfers? Do benefits move between people? Is there such a thing as a substitute? So if Social Security pays for your parents, then you don't have to pay for them. And he would just go on from there. And it was amazing how much you would learn from that. No bunch of big equations or whatever, a few ideas. And so he was a great teacher. He was a mentor, a colleague, and I'm lucky enough to have co-authored one paper with him in 1983. He was a huge public figure and trailblazer for quantitative economic research in wealth and poverty. So two things. First of all, as Larry points out, if you pick up Thomas Piketty's new book, you'll see all the references to Lampman, who built the U.S. wealth accounts and U.S. wealth data all the way through the 50s. It's one of the things he did. If you start reading about, yes! Come on down, John. Can't find you. This is our host, John Lampman, and his son, Rob. Now, Rob's got the most interesting job in the world. He's organizing the World Cup for FIFA. So we're not going to talk about that tonight, but just to show you who we can get to come to this lecture, you know. Okay, I'm just saying a few things about your dad and about Thomas Piketty. He's written up all in that book, and about how all the war and poverty volumes that are coming out this year all go back to the 1964 Council of Economic Advisors report. For the first time, the fraction of families with incomes less than $3,000 popped up, which Molly Orshansky then freely admits that she transformed. She said, I gave it a family size adjuster, and it came out just about where Bob did, and so that's why they like my measure. And when I told last year, I haven't seen another one, but he's a great inspiration to many of us, and I'm going to give you a little bit on Andy Zimbalist, who is a great sports economist, by the way. You know Andy? Yep. That's good. You want him to come? We could do that maybe. As well as Becky Blank, Sheldon Danziger, and more. And so this is Andy Zimbalist on Wisconsin Magazine last spring. This sort of says it. And he is probably the leading sports economist in the country right now. He's at Smith still? Yeah. Yeah. He's Thank you. Okay. Anyway, that's enough, I guess, about Bob for now, but he's dearly remembered by us as a colleague and a friend, and we're very happy to have another great lecture here today. And so today it's Larry. He got his PhD at MIT and never crossed the Charles River. Went right to Harvard. He was a chief economist early in the Clinton administration in the Department of Labor and directed the project on the well-being of children in the Bureau, among other things. Most of us know and constantly quote his book with his partner, Claudia Golden, on the race between education and technology. And now what he's going to talk about today is the impact of neighborhood poverty on low-income families, some of the long-term evaluations of the Moving to Opportunity Grant, along with some other neighborhood and school interventions. And he's written on this recently in JAMA Science, CER, Experimental Criminology, and Cityscape. Now, what makes this interesting today, I think, is that neighborhoods and schools, at least 4 people I know this year at the lectures I usually go to have given lectures on neighborhoods and schools. Jason Fletcher up there in particular, trying to sort out which is more important. Are the peer effects in schools more important than the neighborhood effects in where you live? There's a lot of endogeneity. It's a tough thing to do, but it's a terribly important question. Should we intervene in neighborhoods or should we intervene in schools? How do you best promote child development? At least that's the way I think about it. I'm sure Larry thinks about it quite differently, so Larry, come on up.
So I'm delighted to be here, and it's truly an honor to be able to give the Lampman Memorial Lecture. I think anyone who has worked in these areas have drawn tremendous inspiration from his role both as a public policy figure and as a scholar. And as Tim noted, I was actually reading the Piketty book on the plane out here and noticing, not just the references to Bob Lampman, but the fact that essentially the methodology that Piketty has used to, analyze wealth distribution over hundreds of years in multiple countries is very much derived what he's done in France from the pioneering work that Bob Lampman did in the 1950s in the United States. And similarly, any of us who work on, quantitative work, microdata experiments to try to understand anti-poverty policies are in his debt. So I hope what I'll talk about today at least sheds a little light on some of the issues that he thought so deeply about and greatly influenced. So 50 years after the Civil Rights Act and 50 years after the War on Poverty, a lot has changed in America. A lot has gotten tremendously better. Living standards clearly have improved. Direct measures of discrimination have gone down. Racial gaps in many ways and socioeconomic status gaps have narrowed on many dimensions, but we still have tremendous inequality that's systematic, whether you look at educational outcomes by race, by ethnicity, by the socioeconomic status you grow up in. And increasingly, these differences are being defined sharply by the neighborhood one grows up in and the schools one attends. This period of rising inequality over the last several decades has also been one of rising economic segregation and where people live and where they go to school. And one useful set of figures that Sean Reardon and Kendra Bischoff have put together systematically from 1970 to today is sort of an index of how segregated are people by family income across census blocks or neighborhoods in the U.S. And this is a sort of what's known as an entropy index, but you can think of it as sort of a measure of how unlikely is it for someone who's low income to be living with someone middle income or middle income with someone high income. And basically what you can see is there have been substantial increases in segregation by income, the likelihood. And if you looked back in 1970, African Americans were actually less economically segregated. They were hugely racially segregated in where they lived, but actually less economically segregated than the U.S. population as a whole. But there's been tremendous increase, some from powerful positive forces of the ability of reductions in housing discrimination and the ability of middle-class blacks to move in other areas, but some of the tremendous problems of poor urban areas in the U.S. and poor rural areas and groups being left behind. And overall, there have been substantial increases. If you'd done the same thing with schools, you would see that the likelihood that poor kids are going to school with middle-class kids have been falling over the same period. And while it's, if you look at, things that Tim has done and my colleague Raj Chetty have done recently, looking at gaps in, resources, there are growing gaps in academic achievement by family income and socioeconomic status. And while it's not true that, sort of the probability that you move up in the distribution seems to have changed a whole lot since 1980 to today. So intergenerational mobility looks about the same. The consequences of it are much, much greater in a more unequal society. So the way I like to think about it is if we think of the economy as one big apartment building, and we've always had basement apartments that were less nice than the sort of middle standard apartments that most people live in, and there's always been a penthouse. And it's always been true that some people born in the penthouse fall out, not usually that many and not that far, but they do. Some people born in the middle actually percolate up to the penthouse, and some people born in the basement actually escape. The rates of transition look about the same today as they were 30 or 50 years ago. But what's really different is the quality of those units have changed dramatically. The middle ones have gotten a bit better. The basement apartments sort of got flooded, got a bunch of cockroaches. It used to be you could call a superintendent to clean it up. Now no one responds to your call. The penthouses now have their own elevators, golden and marble floors, and things have, so whether you're born in the penthouse versus born in the basement has a much larger impact on what your well-being is in terms of economic times than the past. And a question I want to think about is, obviously there are things directly changing economic resources, but how have these changing neighborhood environments and how they're attached to schools affect outcomes? The other thing we clearly know from a lot of observational data is that kids who grow up in poorer neighborhoods end up faring, worse on a wide range of economic, education, and health outcomes. There's a very strong positive relationship between neighborhood family incomes and kids' performance in school and later outcomes. This graph just shows you if you take all the zip codes in New York City, the largest school district in the country, bin them into sort of average incomes by zip code, and plot them against kids' test scores. You could do this for college going or later outcomes. You find this very strong relationship. But the adults in those neighborhoods clearly have far worse economic and health outcomes, and there are a large number of theories in sociology and economics and psychology that think that there are real consequences of where you grow up that aren't just your family situation, and that neighborhood peers may greatly influence your aspirations and your choices. They're more mundane but potentially important theories having to do with health, just the stress of being in a dangerous environment, the impacts of greater pollution, and there are, of course, mechanisms such as what schools you get access to and the quality of housing. And the difficulty from data like this of just looking at the correlation, even when you sort of put in everything you can control for, is we really worry that even if the types of people with very low incomes were in very different neighborhoods, maybe this is largely picking up other factors having to do with which families are able to get their kids into better neighborhoods. Would they do better wherever they go, because it's just different parenting styles, different resources we don't measure from standard family income measures. And so what I want to talk a bit about is, what if, we've done a lot of things to try to improve neighborhood environments, place-based policies. We've done a lot to help people try to move, not enough that their entitlements, things like public housing projects that in many cases may have made the neighborhoods more desolate, housing vouchers. What do we know about the causal effects of neighborhood environments and for long-run outcomes of kids, and how much of it is operating through schools versus the black box of all the sort of peers and other physical influences? And what I'm going to argue is that we do have a bit of a renaissance of some nice sources of variation. In particular, I'm going to talk about a major housing mobility experiment that Tim mentioned, Moving to Opportunity, that I've been working on for almost, I guess, about 20 years now, following the kids who got opportunities to be randomly assigned to groups that got vouchers to move to, in quote, better neighborhoods, at least lower poverty neighborhoods, as a potential laboratory. And a lot of work on sort of changes in schools without necessarily changing the neighborhoods kids live in, from things like charter school lotteries, public school lotteries, to a number of other interventions. And what we're going to see, from this is that, they can potentially answer some very, I think, interesting questions about the causal effects of your neighborhood environment and how that works in school environment. And just so I'm not completely remiss, the work on Moving to Opportunity has been a very large project, and there are a large number of collaborators, and I need to call out Jens Ludwig, who's really been a driving force on the long-term version of this, and Lisa Sandman-Matsu at the NBER, who basically manages all aspects of the data and the empirical work with respect to this project. And as Tim said, there are a large number of recent publications that I'm going to try to summarize the main messages. So how do we sort of think of it? If you bear with me, I will not have more equations than just this start. So let's just think about, in principle, some outcomes like, education, economic outcomes, health, risky behavior. We could think of some inputs, in particular, your neighborhood environment, your school, and your family background. And what I'm going to argue today, and there are a number of mechanisms, the neighborhood, poverty could have positive effects through safety, through who your peers are. You could actually tell stories in the other direction, that if rewards are based on a relative basis rather than an absolute basis, say you're in a system where you're lower down in the neighborhood, you may be less likely to get a job or do poorer in school. That can go in the other direction. But in principle, if we can change neighborhoods substantially without changing schools, we can get a very good estimate of the direct impact there. And if we can change schools without having much impact on neighborhoods or family, we can get a very good estimate of the school impact. And what I'm going to argue is moving to opportunity. Fortunately for answering this question, probably unfortunately for the families and for housing mobility policy, shows that when you give poor families housing vouchers and you help them find housing in better off neighborhoods, you can greatly improve their neighborhood conditions measured by neighborhood poverty, by the crime rate, by safety, by health indicators. But with the value of a housing voucher in the U.S., which basically allows you to get an apartment at the 40th percentile rent, you basically can't get a very good school. You're not very different from where you started. There's some improvement, but it's much smaller than the improvement in neighborhood conditions, and it doesn't actually, as we'll see, change your ability to get work or change parents' income very much. So we're going to sort of have a pure change in neighborhood safety and poverty without changing much the income of the families, because we'll see the parents aren't much affected, and without changing school quality very much. So in principle, we can get at what happens when you change your neighborhood a lot, but without changing schools. And I will argue that there are a number of different schooling interventions, but one that's really nice is the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, which is a 97-block area in Harlem of New York City, which has a very strong, run by a tremendously visionary individual, Jeffrey Canada, and with a lot of private foundation support, has a web of neighborhood services from sort of cradle through high school, from baby college, preschool health, neighborhood safety ones, and they've also set up what looks to be a high-performing charter school, the Promise Academy. And so for people living in this zone, you have a sort of higher level of neighborhood inputs, and there's sort of random assignment to who gets into the better school because of lotteries. When you oversubscribe a charter school in many areas, such as New York City, you have to run a lottery, but the school has to be open to people outside the zone. So you have people in poor neighborhoods who don't have the same resources who get in, so we can look at the differential effects of getting into a better school on higher or lower neighborhood resources. And we also have people sort of living at the border who don't get into the school, some who have better access to the neighborhood resources and others who don't, without having great access to the school resources. So basically what we're going to see, and so I'll move from equations to a little more illustrative framework. No doubt there are lines going between all these different factors. That is, neighborhood poverty clearly affects skills directly, earnings other ways. But what we're going to see from the data is it appears when you have plausible sources of variation that getting into a safer neighborhood with higher income individuals has immediate and lasting effects on health. That reductions, it greatly reduces stress, improves nutrition. And, being in a safer environment means you exercise more also, and those really show up on observable things on health on well-being and mental health, and we will see this both through direct physical health measures, through biomarkers, measuring HbA1c for diabetes, as well as subjective questions and surveys. But we're not going to see that those changes without changing schools do a whole lot to your economic outcomes. So it's a great policy improving neighborhood safety, holding schools constant for the well-being of individuals, and one shouldn't downplay it, but one shouldn't think of it as anti-poverty policy by itself. If you're not changing the incentives to work, the skills of the adults, or the opportunities for schooling of the kids, when neighborhood poverty changes, and it also changes school quality, we see improvements in what the next generation brings to the labor market, and then we see substantial improvements on outcomes, non-health outcomes we care a lot about. There certainly would be an extra arrow. We know education, is going to improve health over the long run, and maybe if we see these people, where we change school quality, we'll see this, arrow. But the first order effects seem to be safety and stress really impact on your health, but just being safer and less stressed is not a substitute for a better school or for a training program. And that schools, even to people living in highly stressed environments, are a zone of safety. They can't work miracles, but they systematically seem to improve long-run outcomes. Again, this is all relative. We're not going to take people in the basement and give them a good charter school and move them to the penthouse. But we might greatly increase the chance that they'll move to the middle, or that the basement, they'll have the resources to really invest and improve that basement apartment. So what do we know about neighborhood effects from past research? I will go very quickly. There are millions of great studies out there. I will just point that the traditional approach is part of the game we might call name that residual. So if you start out with the graph like I showed of test scores and neighborhood income or poverty in New York City, you get a super strong relationship. The more you throw in about what you know about the parents, the weaker that relationship gets, and so you're left with, in a cross-section longitudinally, when families move to better areas, things seem to get better, but is that because of the neighborhood, or is that because the family's in better shape and that's why they move to the better neighborhood? When areas get better, things look better for the residents, but in many cases, they're not the same people. Different people are sort of moving in as rents go up. So the name that residual is, you could look at this stuff and say, if you really had better measures of the parents' characteristics, it would all go away. Neighborhoods, just aren't per se gonna. Any neighborhood, if a kid's gonna get in trouble, they can find other kids they'll get in trouble with. If a kid's sort of got good guidance, they'll find peers regardless. And it's just you're not controlling well for parental attributes. On the other hand, you can say many of those parental attributes are themselves outcomes of having deprived environments and neighborhoods, and maybe we're over-controlling for things. It's not even clear what sign the bias is. And then there's measurement error. Are we really, is the census block really a good measure of a neighborhood? Maybe if you really had the good measure, it'd have a much larger impact. So name that residual. I think we certainly know there are strong correlations there, but it's very tough to make causal statements in that from that. And a number of attempts have been made to sort of have what I would call sort of quasi-experimental variation, where you change people's neighborhoods greatly in ways we think are uncorrelated with the unobserved attributes that may lead to difficulty in sorting this out. The classic original study of this was the Gautreaux study in Chicago, which came out of a housing desegregation case from public housing in Chicago that James Rosenbaum and colleagues have studied. The initial results were incredibly positive of this in finding people who moved longer distance to suburbs, their kids doing much, much better. But a huge issue with the research design is that they only found people who were sort of surviving in those areas. The attrition rates were well over 50, 60%, even several years out. And it's not clear it was clearly quasi-random, since you could actually hold out for a different type of neighborhood. and longer-term studies by Greg Duncan and his colleagues find some positive effects, but nothing that look like what are using big administrative data, the large impacts, sort of doubling going to college and stuff, than Rosenbaum and his colleagues. Several public housing studies, in Toronto, Chicago, and some in England using variation by what schools you get in neighborhoods, all using sort of quasi-experimental techniques, find very little impact of changes in neighborhood environments on kids' outcomes in terms of test scores or later outcomes and earnings. The other interesting thing about them is that, for example, the Gibbons, Silva, and Weinhardt one, you're looking at kids in the same school and changing and living in different neighborhoods, so we're holding school quality constant there. And in Oreopoulos and Jacob is, in many cases, the source of variation don't change the schools by much. If they tear down the Robert Taylor homes and you move, a few blocks away in Chicago, you're essentially going to the same type of school. So we're changing the neighborhood environment, in many of these cases, a fair amount, but we're not changing schools very much. And that's going to be very similar to what happens, I think, the cleanest and longest term follow-up, which is the moving to opportunity experiment. So how did moving to opportunity come about? It's a true random assignment experiment done in 5 U.S. cities, back at Boston, Baltimore, Chicago, LA, and New York in the early 1990s, 4,600 families, about 900 per site, living in high poverty public housing, that is public housing projects where the poverty rate in that census block was over 40%. So think of these as the poorest high poverty neighborhoods, highly concentrated poverty in large U.S. cities. They're in the bottom sort of 3% initially of family income in the U.S. distribution. Families in those, neighborhoods and public housing projects were given the opportunity to jump the queue and get vouchers. And in one treatment, we, or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, I somewhat say we because I was actually sitting at the Labor Department when this went on and helped in the design, although it should be noted, the interesting thing about this program is the details of the design were worked out by the Clinton administration in '93, but in fact, the basic idea came from a number of housing advocates who'd been pushing it for a large number of years, and the unfortunate event that was fortuitous for this research was the passage of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1992. Why do I call that unfortunate? It was basically in response to the Rodney King LA riots, one of the more violent and, not very nice events in U.S. recent history of racial divide. But what it did do is, for a brief moment, Congress thought about inner city problems in urban areas and threw some money at sort of demonstration projects to learn about different ways of dealing with inner city poverty problems. And so that was the birth of Moving to Opportunity. And so we were initially testing sort of, the idea was let's do Gautreaux with true random assignment and greatly change neighborhoods and see what that did. It was called Moving to Opportunity, of the belief that changing the environment would change opportunity and impact the adults and then the kids' economic outcomes. We also thought a lot about health, but the focus was on economic outcomes and the initiation. So in one treatment, if you won a voucher, we played social engineer. We said, we know better than you, so this is somewhat paternalistic. We're not going to let you use that voucher wherever you want to go. You can only use the voucher if you move to what we call a higher quality neighborhood, defined as an area that had the poverty rate below 10% in the 1990 census. It's tough with a voucher to find such a place in the mid-1990s in New York City or Boston. So we gave help with mobility counselors, but you should really think of these as housing people, not people who were follow-up in some way providing economic advice or training. It really was a couple of visits and help with housing. The other group, which we call Section 8 or traditional voucher, got the standard Section 8 vouchers and had access to all the help anyone getting a Section 8 voucher in moving. There are local housing advocacy groups. They're not used very heavily. And so we have basically, by lottery, some people living in the highest poverty areas got an opportunity to move with support. And what we'll see is this is sort of the before. This is from Chicago. So think of high-density, large public housing units. And who are the people who were eligible for this? In the mid-1990s, who lived in high-poverty public housing units in the U.S.? They were largely minority, African-American and Hispanic. It varied a lot across sites. Baltimore and Chicago were incredibly segregated, almost 100% black. LA, New York, and Boston were more mixed. Why did people sign up for this program? So think of these as volunteers, people in public housing who wanted to move, wanted to get their housing support, with greater mobility. About a third of the people in these units signed up and got into the lottery. They largely were talking about crime. They were not talking about wanting to move somewhere to get a better job. Sometimes they talked about schools, not very often. Crime and housing quality were usually the things people talked about as their motivation for wanting to enter this. And we've been studying this, since the mid-1990s, and our, 4 to 7 years out, we basically found the links I was talking about, really good for mental and physical health of the adults. Girls seem to be thriving, especially on health outcomes. Boys not doing nearly as well. Little impact on economic sufficiency, self-sufficiency. Some evidence that maybe things were getting better over time on the economic side for the treatment group. Sociologists said, well, you would have found much bigger economic effects if this really were a big intervention. So they argued it was a weak treatment, many. Economists said, if it didn't affect earnings, who cares? But we sort of think it was interesting that it affected health and not earnings, and a lot of people said, reasonably, you haven't looked at really the interesting group, kids who are really young, who are growing up, they weren't old enough to see longer run outcomes, so that's what we did 10 to 15 years out in the latest round of data collection from Moving to Opportunity, which was an incredible effort led by Lisa Sanbonmatsu at NBR and working with the team at the Institute, ISR, and the survey data collection team, JSRC at Michigan. And amazingly, we've been tracking these families since 1994, and we were able to, in the first stage, track down 75% of them and eventually get 90% effective response rate. So attrition is not a big issue, and with administrative data. There's a huge interest these days in using administrative data to replace survey data, and I'm a big fan of it, but if you're not, the problem with the U.S. is we're still 50 states and hundreds of jurisdictions, and when you have an intervention going on in all these different places, it turns out you have to get the permissions of every single state and every single different agency of every single state. It's not good enough to get the UI one, you have to get the criminal justice, but that doesn't get you the juvenile justice records. So it was actually harder to collect the administrative data than to actually do the survey and track down 10,000 low-income individuals, given all the permissions. And in many cases, the survey data is more complete. I think for crime, you clearly need to get the administrative data, but on many economics ones, it's not that obvious. Every single school district separately had to be. So we're not yet, and Tim is trying to create a registry of administrative data in the U.S., but we're not yet Sweden or Norway in terms of the ability to do this. So this was a lot of hard work to put together data to analyze groups. What do we look at as outcomes? Essentially, there are two types of estimators. There's what's known as intent to treat. That is, we just compare, and this is totally clean. We have random assignment. There are people who are eligible for an experimental voucher versus people who weren't, up to sort of random noise on who showed up one day and got in the lottery. Effectively, the only thing that should be different about the treatment and control group is, one group got offered this voucher. If you believe that being offered a voucher 15 years ago that you didn't use probably doesn't have much impact on your life, you can blow up those intent to treat estimates in what are known as treatment on treated estimates by essentially dividing by the lease-up rate or compliance rate. So only about half the people, I shouldn't say only, so who actually leased up, about half the experimental group, 47%. Why does not everyone offered these vouchers actually lease up and able to find it? It's not that easy to find housing with a housing voucher in a tight labor market in the mid-1990s if you're a poor family and have never gone out searching in these areas. We'd actually anticipated only 33% when we were designing the program. So this actually is, says something about the, stick-to-itness and grit of these families in searching. You only have 4 months or 6 months, depending on the site, to lease up. When you with a regular Section 8 voucher, you got about 60%. So you can think of, when I show you an estimate, you might want to multiply it by 2.1 to say what does a mover get for the experimental group, and 1.7 for the Section 8 group. So what does the after look like? You saw the before. You shouldn't think of the after as the penthouse on Park Avenue. They are definitely nicer and safer neighborhoods. This is some of the moves in Chicago. But think of them as the sort of 40th percentile U.S. urban neighborhood. So to the sociologists who say this is a weak treatment, we are not moving people into the wealthiest areas in these metropolitan areas, but I think there is sort of the Lake Wobegon problem. Not everyone can live in an above average neighborhood. And if you're starting with people who are in the bottom 5% and you're doing an actual policy with the value of sort of what a housing voucher is, getting people to the 30th, 40th percentile is probably about as large as you can imagine, a program doing. So while it might be an interesting intellectual question, what if The Prince and the Pauper, and there are a number of movies and books of that type, what if you took the poorest kid and moved them into a palace? It's probably not that big a policy relevant question. So what happened to the neighborhoods of people offered these vouchers? In the first year, starting out, basically, the typical family in MTO lived in a neighborhood with over a 50% poverty rate. So these are some of the poorest areas in the United States in a time where the national poverty rate was about 11 or 12%. They were 3 standard deviations above the national mean in terms of the distribution of census tracts and poverty. The move initially had a big impact. The movers had a 35% decline. That's sort of 2 standard deviations, more than 2 standard deviations in the distribution of, they sort of moved from the bottom 5% of neighborhoods to areas, with around 14, 15% poverty on average. Why is it not under 10%? Because that's the policy rule. Because it was under 10% in 1990. Where you can lease up in 1996 that had an under 10% poverty rate in 1990 probably has about a 15% poverty rate in 1996. It's a much better neighborhood than where you started, but it's probably a little declining. That's why there are vacancies that you can move to. I think the best way to summarize what this treatment looks at is this graph. This graph is the distribution over the next 15 years of the average poverty rate of the neighborhoods that people who moved with an MTO experimental voucher had. And this is what they would have had if they didn't get the voucher, because those are the control people who look like them. And basically what you can see is that if you had this opportunity and got a chance to use it, you shouldn't think of them living in, under 5%, the richest areas in America, but they're basically in the sort of 15%, 18%, over 56% of these families are living in under 20% poverty rate areas on average over the next 15 years. So that's, about the 30th, 40th percentile of the distribution in U.S. urban areas, whereas if you don't get access to this voucher and this help, you're living in 40 to 50% poverty areas on average. Only about 5% of control group families end up in areas with sort of under 20% poverty, on average. So, we're not getting people under 10% persistently, but if you think of over time, the gap does shrink. So on average, from 17 or a total of 35 to about 5 or 10, and it shrinks for 2 reasons. What a lot of people say is, these people are moving out. There's not that much of it. There's some. They went from sort of a 14, 15% to low 20s, but that's some of the upper tail. What's really happening is the control group over time is improving. Remember, these are people who wanted to move, but some of it is because the neighborhoods they started out in, this is not a static world. The control group does not actually tell you what happened if we made someone live in the Robert Taylor homes the next 15 years. Of course, the Robert Taylor homes were demolished over this period. So a lot of that movement was, some of the worst neighborhoods in the U.S. were actually blown up, literally, demolished, and the families were relocated. Some lucky enough, they actually had vouchers and were able to use them, so they ended up in lower poverty areas, usually not of timing of their choice. But they do show improvements over time, and that's most of this narrowing of this gap. That's going to be important in thinking about, whether it's the cumulative exposure to neighborhoods that matter, which I think matters a lot for human capital development, or whether it's the current situation, which we think matters a lot for crime. So in the early period, when there really are huge gaps between the neighborhoods of the treatment and control, you do see pretty large reductions in crime for the treatment, kids versus over time. As the neighborhoods become more similar, that sort of fades away. But some things like health, which seem more cumulative, seem to sort of bear out even over the longer run. So I would say that this is a pretty significant treatment in changing, neighborhood conditions. It's not moving you to Park Avenue, but it's, in the feasible set, pretty big. What about, if you were a regular voucher? It's a serious treatment. It's taking people from 40 to 50% poverty to 20 to 30%. Those are still pretty poor neighborhoods in the U.S. distribution, but they're a lot different from where they're starting out. And any other measure of neighborhood, characteristics, it's a much larger change in poverty than it is the share minority. This was targeted to poverty. The typical neighborhood they're moved to is still 3/4 minority. So, think of it moving to high minority, middle class neighborhoods, not to, very white neighborhoods. Large reductions in self-reports of, criminal victimization, improvements in sort of neighborhood conditions, better housing. So the way to think of this is you're paying the same amount of money for housing. There's no impact on your housing costs, but you're getting a better package of neighborhood and housing characteristics. So there is some wealth effect. You don't have to, in some sense, work as hard to get better neighborhood characteristics, but the sort of budget set, the incentives to work are still very much the same. The way housing vouchers and public housing work is they tax you if you increase your earnings. Every dollar you earn in the labor market beyond some initial point is a 30% tax rate that raises your rent effectively. And this is, when you talk to individuals in this program, quite salient. So the incentives to work were not changed very much, but you do have a much better housing situation. And the other thing to notice is, well, the percentile rank of neighborhood was going from sort of in the bottom 10% to sort of 30 to 40th%. The schools are better than the neighborhoods for these kids because many of these school districts already had a lot of school choice going on before and over this period. So in Boston, even if you're living in the poorest neighborhood, you may be going to a school in the control group in a very different one, and the change in school access is much smaller, 3 percentile points, than neighborhoods, and that's going to be sort of key. So what did MTO do? It raised mental health, large improvements in mental health, physical health. Basically, it's has things that look like the best antidepressants or stress reducers, and it's really good for weight loss and extreme, and that's a huge issue in this population. The typical adult, has BMI, in the 30 range. Extreme obesity is a very large problem in this group. No detectable effects on economic self-sufficiency, and it's not that you can't improve the economic self-sufficiency of single mothers who this were, or their kids living in public housing. In fact, we have different types of programs that don't change the neighborhood, such as Jobs Plus that MDRC has been doing with the exact same population, which changed the rules of the public housing program or voucher to say you no longer lose 30 cents for every dollar you earn. The Earned Income Tax Credit, which also something pushed by Robert Lampman and others, which raises the incentives to work, and the nature of the macro labor market can have very large impacts on these families, But you shouldn't think exactly where you live in a metropolitan area. While there's been a lot of work, the spatial mismatch is really a driving force. You know, you can live 10, 20 miles away, you're still largely in the same labor market, and you still have the same skill set. The incentives to work and the overall labor market opportunities seem much more important. And we also see substantial, along with the mental health, substantial improvements in subjective well-being. And I won't go through all the individual numbers, but I want to show a couple of graphs just to finish this up on the adults. This shows you how large the change was in poverty. Since we have 5 different sites and we have 3 sort of treatment groups by site, we can sort of aggregate this to the 15, the difference in LA between being a control group or being a Section 8 group or being experimental. How much did poverty change on average across? LA was a sort of bigger experiment than Boston. And how much did obesity improve? You can do this to mental health, and what you see is things look very linear. The bigger the improvement in the neighborhood environment and economic segregation, the bigger improvements in health. And this is true for subjective well-being, health, and all mental health measures. So it looks like the bigger the dosage, the bigger the impact. And the other thing is there's nothing going on the economic side. So in 2001, when we did the interim study of MTO, this red line is the control group, and those are the treatment groups. And you can see there's this little gap there. So we were really hopeful. This is the value of having all the data. We were really hopeful. It looked sort of positive. It had been a little negative when we first saw them. Maybe, if you invest enough and you move to a good neighborhood, things will really improve, and maybe 4 years wasn't enough to see it. Well, if you look out the next 10 years, basically these lines just lie on top of each other. 2 things should jump out. Changing the neighborhood environments didn't do doodly squat for the measured economic outcomes, but the world really did change. 30% of them were working at baseline, and over 50% of them were working in the boom of the late 1990s. So welfare reform and the boom of the late 1990s, the macroeconomy and changes in incentives had tremendous impact. The neighborhood environment didn't do very much. And just also to, if you let the parents themselves assess what this was, they would say they're much, much happier and less stressed. So my bottom line from this for the adults is I call it moving to tranquility rather than moving to opportunity. Since you're safer and happier and healthier, but you're not necessarily moving up the economic. It's not an anti-poverty program. What about what happened to the kids? And the key is if we look about what happened to neighborhoods, neighborhoods changed on average by 1.5 standard deviations over 15 years in the distribution in the U.S., 18 percentage points for these movers in poverty. What about the schools? The schools only changed by 1/3 as much, 6 percentile points in a tote. Free lunch fell by much smaller than poverty. So the poverty of kids in your school changed much less than the poverty of kids in your neighborhood, and indicators of the overall school climate show very modest changes. So what that meant for kids is neighborhood environments change a lot, schools don't, and you see for girls, substantial improvements systematically 1 year out, 4 year out, and here 15 years out in measures of health. Obesity fell dramatically for the mothers and the girls, and all measures of distress and depression are improving. Nothing much changing for the boys, and nothing much happening in risky behaviors or educational attainment from getting to these different areas. So overall, we're finding that moving substantially your economic environment, but not changing your parents' income very much, and not changing your school very much, at least for girls, does make you much, moving away from danger and domestic violence, which we did see is incredibly important in the health and development of adolescent females. The boys, things go in both directions. In some level, you went from an area where you might have been in the middle of the distribution of being tough and, and where you were in sort of academic preparation to one where you were sort of tougher and less academically prepared, and we sort of see a little evidence in that direction. But in the short run, things did seem to improve for the boys, but eventually they ran into some barrier and things did not stick. But what we do see, and this is where I want to lead to the finish with the school stuff, is where MTO did change the school environment. So what I'm doing here is I'm plotting these sort of changes across our different groups by indicators of the school environment. So on average, the school environment didn't change very much, but at some sites, it did change a lot. In LA in particular, there was a big improvement for the experimental versus the control. And some of these changes are actually in the wrong direction. So I'm conditioning on poverty. In Boston, the choice programs and other things meant if you stayed in Boston, the schools actually got better. And the ones moving out ended up in what appear to be worse schools on a number of dimensions. And if you line up the kids' outcomes, this is for boys, but for girls also, by the change in the school environment, and this is holding the neighborhood poverty constant, and it looked a bit stronger if I didn't control for neighborhood poverty, but since neighborhood poverty was basically unrelated to the school outcomes, it doesn't change this very much. You do see a strong positive relationship between the improvement in school environments and what the kids do, and this is true both for educational performance and for involvement in risky behaviors, crime, teenage pregnancy. And what's striking, and there I'm controlling for neighborhood poverty. So I'm sort of asking, what happens when I change school quality holding neighborhood quality, where neighborhood quality is sort of measured by poverty constant? What are other interventions that experimentally or quasi-experimentally change school quality but don't change neighborhood quality show? And we're finding a lot of systematic evidence. So what I'm not going to tell you is that we know that if you build a charter school, good things will happen. What we'll have are possibility theorems. That is, we know there are some high-performing charter schools, there are better-performing public schools than others. We have experiments where oversubscribed charter schools that have lotteries tend to be the high-performing ones. There are a lot that aren't oversubscribed that aren't performing particularly well. The kids who get into them, what we're now seeing is in longer-term follow-up studies by David Deming and his colleagues, a former student of mine who is now teaches at the Harvard Grad School of Education, Josh Angrist and his collaborators, Roland Fryer and Will Dobby, is when we're putting these, we were seeing some initial test score things, but now we're seeing 5-10 years later, long-run outcomes, greater college going, greater high school graduation rates, reductions in crime, getting into higher quality schools, whether you win the lottery in Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District to get out of the poorest schools, or whether you get into an urban charter school in Boston or in New York City, or even if you inject those charter school practices into public schools, as Roland has been doing in Houston and Denver, we're starting to see, again, possibility theorems that if you greatly change the school, these schools have characteristics of longer school days, teachers, who are using data-driven instruction, things that some people have called no excuses, but that doesn't really look what's going on. It looks more like they have more inputs and they're a longer school day and getting more encouragement. We clearly see that that can improve kids' long-run outcomes, even holding their neighborhood environments constant. And similar things are now coming from the amazing ability. Here's where administrative data is good. Things like the IRS data that Raj Chetty and others have done, or the Scandinavian data, where we can match kids in their classroom experiences early in life to their later life outcomes now, use the Tennessee STAR class size reduction experiment, which randomized kids across classrooms in Tennessee in the mid-1980s. Those kids are now in their mid to late 20s, so they're old enough that we can actually see long-run outcomes. And what you see is if you get into a better kindergarten class, holding your neighborhood constant and your parents constant, 20 years later, you're more likely to have gone to college. You go to a better college and you're earning more. If we reduce your class size, you're doing better on those outcomes. If you got a better teacher, And this is from a randomized experiment, and you have similar things coming on in the huge New York City database that Raj Chetty, John Friedman, and Jonah Rockoff have been doing. And what you find again is and it doesn't just look like, early interventions are really important, but even if you get a better 8th grade teacher or a better 10th grade math teacher, it seems to show up on later long run earnings. Everything is not all totally determined by your early environment. That doesn't mean the early environment isn't incredibly important, but here we're seeing 2nd through 8th through 10th grade teachers all sort of improving long run outcomes. So, and I think one of the coolest ones is the Harlem Children's Zone. Again, it's a unique. It has if we could give every public school the amount of support from hedge fund and hedge fund guys that the Harlem Children's Zone do, it's not clear. It's just some of this is more a possibility theorem. I don't know if it's feasible to get the number of resources they get into an average urban school. They're not all going to have as charismatic a principal as Jeffrey Canada, who will get, the Robin Hood Foundation to give them tons of money. But it does give you an idea of what if you have a tremendous, school environment with lots of resources in a very poor neighborhood. Does it matter for kids' long-run outcomes? And what Will Dobby and Roland Fryer, my former student and colleague, have been finding is that now we sort of see kids 6 years out from when they got into middle school is big effects on math achievement, college enrollment, reductions in risky behavior, whether it's teen pregnancy or incarceration, and they are noticeable, but little impact on the things that the neighborhood environment seems to impact, little impacts on mental health. Kids are not sort of showing up super happier yet. They're not, having fewer accidents, but they are sort of, doing much better in going through school. And the other estimates suggest that this is likely to turn into better long-run outcomes. And, substantial impacts on test scores and going to college, reductions in risky behavior, not much going on in health. So what I see from the recent sort of experimental analyses is that, your initial conditions through age sort of 0 to 18 matter a lot to your life. And even holding your parents constant, the neighborhood you grow up in matters a ton. But it appears that things like neighborhood safety, stress, how well off your neighbors are, matter a ton for health and well-being. Don't by themselves, the job networks you get from moving a better neighborhood don't seem to be that valuable per se if you do not have the schooling and the skills to take advantage of them. Improvements in skills in schools seem to have very persistent impacts. But the big question going forward when I think about policy and where I want to conclude is I suspect there may be a huge micro, macro, and this is something I can't easily do an experiment to assess. So at the micro level, we have really good evidence that if, holding the distribution of teachers constant or the distribution of schools, if I get you into one of the better schools or get you a better teacher, I'll improve your outcome. But, at some level, that's a musical chairs game. If we're holding the distribution of teacher quality constant, it's great for science to see what does getting a better teacher do to your outcome, but just rearranging, the teachers on, in fact, the effects seem to be a bit bigger for poor kids, so we would be better off if we gave better teachers than the others, even holding the constant, but that's hard to imagine a political outcome that's going to, poor schools are going to outbid the rich schools for all the, more talented teachers. So what we really need is some way of improving to scale the quality of schools rather than, possibility theorems. And here, attempts to take some of this literally. So we see that smaller classes lead to better outcomes. But sometimes if you just mandate smaller classes like states like California do, you don't hold out everything else constant. If all of a sudden the big rich districts have to bid more for teachers and the poor districts do, you'll get this problem that you may reduce class size, but you may actually end up with worse teachers, which seems to be a sort of bigger input. So you need to think about how in the macro level to improve those sort of quality and resources. I mean, there is some evidence, the old Carden-Kruger work that looked at the aggregate, that does suggest that if, as a statewide, you can improve, the pupil-teacher ratio and the sort of, compensation and quality of teachers, you do seem to get outcomes. But that's data that's 70 years old in terms of the source of variation. So we don't have a lot of possibility theorems at the more macro level there. And at the neighborhood level, there's a big caveat. So it does not seem to be true that just within New York City or Chicago, moving you around to a different neighborhood without changing the school lot for your kids will do a lot for you economically. That's a very different thing than saying the broader metropolitan labor market isn't important. What we do see, like when we saw those huge improvements in the employment of the mothers from 94 to 99, is the state of the local labor market matters a ton, but it isn't the particular neighborhood you live in that really matters. So a stronger macroeconomy, a stronger metro area, and there do seem to be the total level of segregation in a metro area. There's emerging evidence, work Raj Chetty is doing on differences in intergenerational mobility across different parts of the U.S., that Tim and others have done, that suggests that less economically segregated metropolitan areas, which also tend to have higher school quality, tend to take families at the same percentile of the national income distribution. They're much more likely to have upward mobility. And so part of this is things that create a stronger macroeconomy that reduce the economic segregation at the entire metro area or national level also seem to feed back into the politics of purchasing better schools and improving school quality. So it may be that the micro evidence on neighborhoods doesn't indicate what the broader effects of some things that reduce sort of the inequality and segregation. So I think a tighter macro labor market, investing in schools, which is not something we've had for a while in the U.S. I mean, not since the late 1990s, early 2000s, would go dramatically, and that we need to sort of combine, I think, this very good experimental evidence with what happens at the broader sort of macro level. And it's possible, if you're France and you're Esther Duflo, to actually run experiments at the MSA level when they randomized across 250 French metropolitan areas on how much they gave training programs and job search assistance to unemployed youth. And you actually can find a lot of the, that in a tight labor market, these things really are valuable. Training programs, firms hire people quicker, they upgrade their workers. In a really weak labor market, it's all just musical chairs. So I think the key thing is that we need to invest in, what look like high return investments in schools, improvements in neighborhoods, but it's all much, much more difficult in the sort of weak macro environment we currently see. And so one needs to think about that also. As going back to Robert Lampman and JFK and a rising tide, it doesn't automatically lift all boats, but the investments needed to lift all boats are a whole lot more powerful when there is a rising tide. So that's all I have.
Questions? All right. My problem always is that the MTO people selected in the movie.
Yes.
And the charter school people selecting the charter schools.
Yep.
So the external validity, I always want to know about something about those who had the opportunity but didn't take it.
Right.
And how big is that group?
Okay, so in the MTO case, depending on site, if you look on what are the characteristics among people who lived in those public housing units who elected to sign up for MTO, I think you should think of, this is really crude. So on the observables, they don't look that different. The one thing they're observably a little different on is they tended to be having lived in public housing less shorter duration on average, and they tended to be less likely to have family also living in the same unit. So think of them as somewhat less connected to their neighborhoods, which is why they wanted to move. There is a bit of positive selection on sort of, you have to have your act somewhat together to actually pay attention to the flyers, to show up and fill out the baseline survey. So there's some positive selection. There's some negative selection that if things were going really well, you didn't want to sign. So they look somewhat like this middle group. The demolishment natural experiment, like Brian Jacob in Chicago, does get us the non-volunteers, and looks very similar that when you're changing neighborhoods without changing schools much, you're not getting much impact. But I think, so when I think of the moving to opportunity group, you should think of people, who started out very, very disadvantaged and wanted to try to sort of move. So think of it as a volunteer. It's not, the population that if you, mandated, changes in neighborhoods, and it wouldn't be the exact same population if you made investments in these neighborhoods and improved them. On the other hand, that's a complicated question because, there's a lot of, a lot of moving out and other things that happen when you do place-based policy. But that's a very good question. In terms of the charter schools, I think what we do know is the following, more from public school choice. So in some like the New York City and Charlotte Mecklenburg, you're sort of defaulted into having to make some choices, but the neighborhood school could be the choice. There have been information interventions like Justine Hastings and her collaborators have done where you've tried to make it easier to fill out these forms, and on the margin have taken the types of people who don't normally sign up for changing for the lotteries, and you've seen the same sort of positive impacts, but we don't have long-run results for those groups. But again, the observable characteristics, aren't that different. And in many cases, again, it's people who are more, you have this double mix. People who are really dissatisfied with their schools and kids have big problems. So in MTO, the other interesting thing, who actually moved when they had the opportunity to move, it's actually somewhat negatively selected based on how bad your kids were doing, particularly if you had boys who had a lot of problems. You really wanted to get out of where you were more motivated to move.
And then you might very easily be happier because
Yeah.
the objective was to get away from crime.
Yeah, so if we think about the happiness thing, what did these people say they wanted? They wanted safety and calm, and they actually did get it, so it does. But the interesting thing is it isn't all, some people have criticized, they won a lottery, so they say they're happy. Well, the one thing we do know, these are real depression measures, and I think 15 years later, but we actually do have, again, maybe they can fake their blood in ways we don't know, but we actually did. One of the interesting things is it's a lot easier to, and today we can, taking biomarkers is pretty easy, pricking sort of blood, and things like C-reactive protein, which is a stress indicator that's picking up this thing, do show real effects from these moves. So the tranquility does seem to be affecting things in ways that are not just survey question answers.
I saw Bob, and then Chris, and then back there, ma'am. You're to be third. Don't go away.
Yeah.
Very quick question. You're characterizing the kind of moves that are made in MTO as neighborhood quality moves. Mm-hmm. But they're in fact moves from the pathology of a public housing environment to a private rental market environment.
Yeah.
And isn't there something about that change in those dimensions that you're not picking up by just talking about changing?
It would be if the control group were static in the public housing environment, but the vast majority of the control group end up moving into private housing environments over this time because their units were demolished and they were people who wanted to move. So the counterfactual for the treatment versus control is not one group's in private housing and one's mainly in public housing. It's one group's in private housing in lower poverty neighborhoods on average, the other group's largely in private housing and still in very high poverty neighborhoods. We've done a bunch of, so there's variation across the sites in the demolishment rates and the public housing, whether it's moved. So we've done a bunch like those graphs I showed you of the degree of poverty. What if you try to break up the thing into the public housing 0, 1, moved at all 0, 1 as indicator functions versus just sort of a continuous function of poverty? I wouldn't press 15, I can turn it into 30, or I can turn it into, sort of 60 points breaking up by race, there's this interesting quirk in public housing. You can, if you have same number of siblings, but they're of different gender, you get a bigger voucher than otherwise because you need an extra bedroom, so you're more likely to move. So there is variation in what type of unit. So it turns out it really does look like it wants the continuous sort of poverty measure and not sort of just public housing versus not, or did you move versus not. I mean, I wouldn't say this is blow you away variation, but it looks much more like the nature of the neighborhood, even in groups where everyone's moving into private housing, than public housing per se.
Chris?
If you look at the boys that moved when they were infants, sort of compared to the boys that moved when they were older, do you see the same sort of nothing, or is it just another pattern?
Yeah. Infants, I can't say, sort of less than school age at the time of the move is a large enough group that we've broken up, and if you look in our papers, have it. And the hope on doing the long run one was you would find that this group really didn't pick up the same behaviors and would, but, in terms of crime and in terms of schools, those kids are not old enough that we have later labor market outcomes yet, but they're sort of just about high school graduation, where, you're seeing nothing on the test scores, with the one exception, that, if you made LA sort of a separate site by itself, and again, one doesn't want, one can always pull out a data point, things look a lot better for the boys and the kids. And LA is the one place where school quality really changed in those directions. And the moves were much longer. The typical move in LA was more than 10 miles. The typical move in the other places were much shorter. So some people have hypothesized the boys go back to old neighborhood, but the kids who grew up without that, you wouldn't think that'd be a big issue. I think they have a tough time in those schools, and they didn't change the schools that much, but we couldn't find anything systematic when you put the 5 sites together that looked like the younger ones were doing better. The one caveat I would make about that, is, over time, as the treatment effect sort of becomes a bit smaller, if key issues or what you're doing in middle school and stuff, the gap is sort of smaller in neighborhoods for those younger cohort than for the older one, but they're getting longer exposure.
I was curious about what you think are the mechanisms for why you're getting this differential gender effect.
Yeah. That's a great question. We're much better at ruling out things than ruling in things, except, we have a lot of qualitative evidence. So things we can rule out is, it really is differential gender responses to the same neighborhoods. It isn't. You might have, maybe families that have boys can't get housing in the same types of areas, and we can look at the siblings and you see this, the boy and girl siblings who are living in the exact same place, and you see the exact same pattern. It isn't. Another hypothesis I had is, the boys just have a lot more problems to start with. If you're already in special ed, if you're already, doing poorly in school or having, problem behaviors, it's going to be much tougher to integrate in the new neighborhood. If you look at the girls, the bottom tail of the girls in the treatment and control groups who looked like they had a lot more problems, special ed, they show the same improvements in health and early improvements in education. And the boys, even in those groups, seem to have problems. And some of it looks like a dynamic, and the boys initially seem to be doing better in the new neighborhoods, and then, we have anecdotal stories, something goes wrong. They get disciplined, they get in trouble, and then things seem to fall apart. The girls seemed to, be more resilient in those shocks. And some of it is, and this is where Kathy Eden has done in a lot of interviews, the girls feel much more a sense of relief of being in a safer environment. Gender codes are quite different in the neighborhoods they've moved to. The boys, and this works less for the younger boys, who wouldn't have, may have developed a set of coping behaviors that were very well set up for the neighborhoods where they came from, but were, eventually not that productive in the new one. And the new ones and the older ones spend more time going back to the old neighborhoods. And it may be, and LA is the only case we have, that if the cost and distance is sufficiently large and the old neighborhood distant, that maybe the boys would have seen a bigger improvement. In LA, you see snippets of that looking like we're getting similar improvements for the boys. But,
And then Bobby, and then Maria, and that's, Maria will get the last question.
Okay.
Then we have refreshments, so don't leave.
Looking at the lease taking with the vouchers, did you attempt to do any analysis of the populations that didn't? I'm sympathetic to the idea that part of why there was not 100% is just that you can't find people
Right.
willing to do that rent. We have to
Yeah.
copy near housing. But I'm also wondering if there might have been some characteristic differences between the groups that were able to lease take and the ones that weren't.
Yeah, I mean, there are observable characteristics that predict the lease taking. Not surprisingly, and we have no idea what it means, we asked a question in the baseline survey, how likely do you think you'd be able to move? How much, that predicts, incredibly strongly, but if, leaving it that we don't know what that means. So people who really thought they would be able to do it were better able to do it. What you do see is that, if you had sort of boys with more problem behaviors who were more likely to move, and, if you were less likely to be, if you had a current job, you were less likely to move. If you had an automobile, you were more likely. I mean, there are some, the younger were a bit more likely of the parents to move than the older. But, there's, it doesn't jump, things like education didn't jump out tremendously strong in this group. I mean, Mark Schroeder at HUD has done a lot of work trying to characterize who the movers were. And, there are systematic differences, but sort of your optimism about the process is the best predictor, as it is in many things. But, whether that's picking up some general, individual attribute or specific one is hard to say.
Bobby?
So far, you focused your analysis either looking at the whole group that was offered an opportunity, or to look only at the people who moved. But presumably, people don't stay in the same place.
Yeah. So
when you add the duration, do you get differential results for those who stay in the better community versus those who maybe?
So the answer is we use what I think is clean experimental variations, which we're always using. I was just characterizing the people who we're always just comparing everyone offered to everyone not. I'm then blowing it up. I'm characterizing the people who are the compliers and blowing it up. But the total estimate always use anyone. There's another approach you can do, which is to throw away the experiment, which is useful descriptively, but has hard causal interpretation. So it is true that if you look at the subset of people who move the most in terms of poverty and stayed there, they are doing better. Their incomes are higher. But whether that is the cause of the neighborhood or the same selection, which is why we're worried about non-experimental estimates, if you really have your act together, you get to a better neighborhood when given the opportunity, but you're the type of person. The problem is we don't know who in the control group those people are, and that's the difficulty. So, we have some indicators like your optimism and stuff, but we're sort of comparing them to everyone in the control group or a set of observables. So, Doug Massey has taken the MTO data and done exactly that, and then you can conclude that if you got to a really good neighborhood and stayed there, good things happen to you. And that's descriptively true, but I think, there are people in the control group who did really well in the world, and maybe they would have been those type of people also if they're in the treatment group. There's just no real way of that I know of that I find convincing to draw that. So I think it's useful descriptively to talk about the pathways, but it's not really using the experiment.
Do you know what proportion stay?
Of the, ones that moved, the, average move, the average one more move over the next 15 years. There's a small group that moves many times. I think, somewhere, it depends by site, maybe a third to a half. There's not that many that are staying in the exact same place. There's a very mobile population, but there's a substantial group that stays in neighborhoods like the one they moved to. So over time, the erosion for the movers, they're sort of in 15% poverty rate neighborhoods on average 1 year after random assignment, and they're sort of 20% 15 years later. So there's some erosion, but there isn't, they're not looking like the 40% that the control group is. But there are not a lot of people who stay in the exact same place. Or this, the average control group member moved, sort of 2.2 times over the sample, and the average, MTO person, moved another couple of times. But if you were a complier, it was less, because, there's a lot of the people who didn't move initially who then looked just like the control group.
Maria.
I'll let Larry get a last point, and then I'll ask you my question. That's my turn. Oh, wait.
Are you ready?
I'm fine. Well, thank you very much.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm fine.
So you mentioned that you participated in, designing MTO, and so now you have had 20 years to think about the process. If you were back in Washington designing another thing just like this, what would you or something, if you had another opportunity to do this kind of a large scale social experiment to address this set of issues, what would you do?
Yeah, I would want to sort of see if I move people to really good to better neighborhoods combined with also focusing on the schools at the same time, could I really get lasting change? If I could improve both those things, if, I set up, receiving neighborhoods and said, eligibility was conditioned on going to certain, getting into certain sets of schools or applying to them as well, I would have thought that would be an interesting way. The one other thing I would like to know that we don't know from MTO is in terms of getting to a good neighborhood, we sort of, because we didn't have the sample size, we decided how are we going to get people to really different neighborhoods. We wanted to test a standard Section 8 voucher, so we put in this restriction in counselors. We would have wanted to have had a fourth group where you had free, we weren't being paternalistic and saying you have to move to this type of neighborhood, but we're going to give you a lot more help finding housing, but give you a free voucher. I would like to have seen, giving people choice, does help and information really change where they go to? We have a lot of descriptive evidence that it does. But I would have wanted, to see, could you really get escape velocity if you, combine the schools with the sort of neighborhoods? And I would have liked to have seen, those sort of changes, and, being able to look, across generations. One of the things we can't do in MTO because of the way the sample describes is we can't look at the next generation of kids because they're actually not human subject stuff. HUD doesn't give us permission to look at them. They obviously weren't in the original sample. None of the sort of consent covers them. So we don't know what, the next generation impact of it is.
Well, Larry, I want to thank you for a wonderful, stimulating talk that touches on something that people are really interested in. I think you set the record